Have you ever wondered what happens when the goddess of marriage decides she's had enough? Not just of betrayal, not just of thunder, but of being reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. Tonight, I'm inviting you into a tale you think you know, but not like this. This is not just mythology, this is a reckoning. What if Hera wasn't jealous but just exhausted? What if the Queen of Olympus was never a title she wanted to keep? And what happens when the most loyal heart learns to be loyal to itself? This is the story of blue flames lit in secret, of quiet women remembering their names, of the day Olympus heard silence and feared it more than war. If you stay with me, you'll witness a transformation, not with swords, not with storms, but with soft footsteps, unspoken vows, and the fire that flickers when dignity returns. This is Hera's revenge era, and it doesn't look like what you expect. Stay until the end, because the most powerful moment, it's the one no one sees coming. Let's begin. A chariot of silence. The skies above the ancient world had already softened into dusk, the kind of dusk that held both silence and memory. Shades of amber kissed the tops of olive trees, and long shadows stretched across stone courtyards. Far above the mortal world, somewhere between stars not yet lit and clouds too tired to rain, a golden chariot moved without sound. It glided over the hush like a whisper unspoken. Within it sat a woman, her back straight, her face calm, her eyes unblinking. Hera, the queen of the gods. But not just that. The goddess of marriage, the keeper of vows, the protector of what was once called sacred. Tonight, she was none of those things. Or perhaps she was all of them, pressed into one quiet figure sitting alone in the sky before Olympus, before thrones and storms and betrayals. She was simply Hera, born from the Titans, raised in a world where silence was safer than questions. Her father Cronus swallowed her siblings whole, afraid of a future he could not control. Her mother, Rhea, wept behind columns of stone, her grief too sacred to name. And Hera watched it all, not with panic, not with noise, but with stillness. She learned early that survival was an art of silence. She learned that love, if it existed at all, must be defended with iron, not petals. She did not dream of adventure. She dreamed of order, of rituals done properly, of homes built to last longer than their foundations. When Zeus came thunder in his eyes, ambition in his blood, she did not fall for him easily. He changed shape to win her, became mist, became bird, became her comfort, her echo, her mirror. He seduced her not with power, but with promise. He told her, "You are the only one I would make my queen." And she, who had never believed in promises, believed him. Their wedding was divine. Gods brought golden apples, rivers sang in tune. The stars arranged themselves in careful patterns above. For a brief moment, even time itself paused. Hera stood beside Zeus and thought, this could work. He would lead, she would steady, he would shine, she would hold. She gave him loyalty wrapped in silence. He gave her chaos wrapped in charm. But gods do not change, and Zeus did not stop. His passions were wide and wild. His curiosity never satisfied. He touched the hearts of nymphs, disguised himself to chase queens, left a trail of half-mortal children behind him, like seeds in the wind. Hera endured. At first, she burned quietly. Then, she began to burn with precision. When he took Io, Hera did not scream. She turned the girl into a cow and assigned her a sleepless watchman with eyes like 100 lanterns. When he took Semele, Hera did not plead. She whispered into her ear, planted doubt like a blade, and watched the girl ask for Zeus's true form, a request that lit her world on fire. They call Hera jealous. That is convenient. It is easier to blame the fire than to question the match that lit it. But Hera was not jealous. She was betrayed again and again, and gods, despite their power, still feel the ache of abandonment. She built Olympus into something stable. She raised ceremonies, taught mortals how to wed. She stitched meaning into rituals, and still she was made to look cruel, to look small, to look like the woman who punishes women instead of the woman who had no other place to put her fury. Over centuries, the quiet inside her shifted. It did not roar, it condensed, it thickened, like storm clouds held too long in the sky. She learned to smile while her heart shriveled. She learned to speak in prophecy instead of pain. She gave Zeus counsel he never followed, gave Olympus order it never thanked her for. And now, as the world below grows older, as temples crumble and prayers fade into dust, she begins to wonder what was it all for. There's something new in her now. Not anger, not vengeance. Something colder, something clearer. A recognition that marriage, once a temple, has become a cage. That loyalty, once a crown, now feels like a chain. That silence is no longer sacred. So tonight, as her chariot rolls over the night sky, she does not look back. She watches forward. Somewhere, far below, a mortal woman prays, but not for love, not for children. She prays for power, for resolve, for freedom. Hera hears her. For the first time in a long time, she listens. And that is where this story begins. Not with thunder, but with quiet, and a queen who has finally stopped waiting. The girl before the crown, long before Olympus crowned her queen, before the thrones and wars and weddings written in stone. Hera was just a girl, not in the way mortals grow up, no scraped knees or lullabies, but in the way young goddesses are shaped by watching too much too soon. She was born into a world of imbalance. Her father, Cronus, ruled with suspicion and fear, swallowing his own children to prevent a prophecy. Her mother, Rhea, endured it all with quiet desperation, hiding her youngest in secret, praying not for justice but survival. Hera was not spared the hunger of her father. She spent her first memories in the gut of time itself, suspended in darkness, kept in stasis like a forgotten truth. She could not move, she could not age, but she could think. And she did. Thoughts layered over thoughts, questions without answers. Why had love turned into fear? Why had protection turned into prison? No one answered, so she became her own answer. When Zeus rescued his siblings, cutting open Cronus with a blade of destiny sharp, golden, and fueled by rebellion, Hera emerged into the light fully grown, but not untouched. She carried the silence of that prison with her, like a stone tucked deep beneath the ribs. The kind of silence that teaches you to notice, to wait, to remember. She was not like her brothers. Zeus was all action, Poseidon all wrath, Hades all shadows. Hera was foremeat, intention, breath held before the plunge. She did not throw lightning or shake oceans. Instead, she asked, what comes next? In the early years, while the gods divided the sky, see, an underworld like spoiled children splitting a kingdom, Hera turned her gaze elsewhere. She walked the green ridges of the earth, tracing lines across rivers, whispering blessings into saplings, showing mortals how to bake bread and bind promise to ritual. She was the one who taught them to build hearts and name homes. She showed them how to hold hands and mean it. When others sought power, Hera sought permanence. She did not hunger for command. She hungered for structure, even as Olympus grew into something vast and golden and loud. She preferred the quiet tasks, tending altars, balancing ceremonies, instructing the hours on how to line the seasons properly. The mortal world mirrored her influence. Weddings with braided garlands, sacred vows spoken under moonlight, the reverent hush of a crowd when the couple kissed. But Hera was not naive. She knew chaos. She had lived inside it. Still, she believed deeply that even in a world made of storm and strife, love could have rules. That honor could outlast passion. That gods, if they truly desired reverence, must model restraint. It was not a popular idea among her kin. They called her cold. They were wrong. She simply believed that power meant nothing without discipline, and that love, to be worth anything, had to be chosen again and again. Perhaps that is why, when Zeus first came to her, she resisted. He did not arrive with bouquets. He arrived with masks, as a bird who sang near her window, as a breeze that kissed her shoulders when no one was watching, as a stranger with familiar eyes who showed up by her stream and asked too many questions. He was not subtle, but he was persistent. He courted her like a storm circling the edge of a quiet town, promising rain but bringing thunder. He told her she was the only one who saw him, not the god, not the king, but the boy who had once cut open his father and freed the sky. Hera did not trust him, but she recognized the ache in his voice, the hunger for something sacred, and she thought maybe if she loved him well enough, it might tame him. She was not in love with Zeus. She was in love with the idea of balance, the idea that maybe, just maybe, chaos could be softened by constancy. When she agreed to marry him, the heavens sang. The wedding was divine spectacle, golden apples, ambrosia fountains, the fates themselves weaving new lines into their loom. The hours opened the gates of the seasons just to let spring dance a little longer. Mortals mimicked the rituals for centuries after, unaware of the tears Hera did not let fall that day. Because even then, somewhere in the soft part of her, she knew Zeus was not hers to tame, but she had made a vow. And Hera never breaks a vow. Zeus the suitor. To understand what Hera gave up, you must first understand what Zeus was like when he wanted something. And Zeus always wanted something. He was not like mortal suitors, awkward and earnest. He was not like poets with trembling hands and trembling verses. Zeus was a god of thunder, charm forged into weaponry, ambition cloaked in a dazzling smile. When he set his gaze on Hera, it was not love at first sight. It was conquest, not cruel but inevitable. He did not approach her as himself at first. That would have been too obvious, too vulnerable. Instead, he played a game. First, he became a cuckoo bird, small, wet, pathetic. He landed near her during a spring rain, trembling. Hera, compassionate by nature, lifted the bird into her cloak. She held it close to her chest, whispered warmth into its feathers, unaware that it was Zeus all along, enjoying every heartbeat pressed to his clever disguise. When he shifted back into his godly form, standing taller than trees and smiling with the same confidence he used to separate sky from sea, Hera did not scream. She slapped him. Then she walked away. But Zeus was nothing if not persistent. He tried poetry next. Not well written, but enthusiastic. He shaped clouds into love notes, sent her rainfall scented like wildflowers, carved her name into mountaintops where only eagles would see it. He praised her wisdom, her restraint, her power. But Hera was not swayed by flattery. She wanted evidence, not words. So Zeus changed his tactics again. He helped her, quietly, without announcement. When minor gods quarreled over territory, he supported her judgments. When storms threatened harvest festivals she had planned, he held back his lightning. When a mortal king tried to dismiss her rights, Zeus turned his throne into splinters. And Hera began to wonder, maybe he could change. Not because of her, but for her. It was a dangerous hope. But hope, for Hera, was always dangerous. The proposal was quiet, just the two of them, standing in a meadow where olive trees bowed gently to the wind. Zeus said, "Let us build something no one else has." He did not say love. He said something because even then, he knew love was too wild a word for what they were about to begin. Hera, who had seen kingdoms fall from pride, who had watched her own father swallow his future out of fear, Hera looked into the eyes of the storm and said, yes. Their wedding was the kind of event that set new standards for eternity. The Houri painted the skies in shades never seen before. The muses sang until the stars wept. Even Hades, notoriously unimpressed, sent a gift, rare wine that warmed even the bones of gods. The vows were spoken not in words but in winds, wrapped around the world like a spell. Zeus promised power. Hera promised permanence. He gave her Olympus. She gave him order. They crowned each other not with gold, but with roles. King, queen, but not equals. Never equals. At first, it worked. Zeus calmed. A little, Hera glowed. A lot. They were the center of the pantheon divine celebrities, divine rulers, divine lovers. Mortals built temples in their image. Priests told stories of their unity, of thunder and grace intertwined. For a while, Olympus ran like clockwork. The seasons obeyed. The stars listened. But love built on storms is never steady. And Zeus was not done wanting. He grew restless. Curiosity returned to his bones. Desire whispered like old songs in his ear. He began to wander. At first, only in thought, then in form. He became wind again, and then golden rain, and then a swan. He visited queens and nymphs, left behind myths and suns and wreckage. And Hera, she remained still, watching. She did not rage. Not yet. She remembered her vow, and she waited for Zeus to remember his. But vows mean different things to different gods. And Hera, goddess of marriage, found herself married to a man who believed that love could bend as long as it dazzled. It was not betrayal in Zeus's eyes. It was hunger. And hunger, in Olympus, was always excused. But Hera was not a woman who excused. She endured. She adjusted. She planned. And somewhere deep within her, the part of her forged in her father's silence, the part that remembered how to survive without being seen, a storm began to gather. Not thunder, not fire, something colder, a reckoning. But that comes later. For now, all you need to know is this. She said yes, and he promised forever. And somewhere in that promise, the first crack began. Cracks in Olympus. In the early days, Olympus gleamed. Not just in marble and firelight, but in the way a new home gleams before anyone starts leaving dirty dishes in the sink. There were feasts grand, excessive, glittering. There were jokes told by Dionysus that made even Athena snort into her wine. There were long walks at the edge of the clouds, where Hera would stand beside Zeus and look out across the mortal world like it was a painting they had hung together. She thought briefly that it would last. They were the divine pair, king and queen, thunder and order. She made Olympus livable. He made it loud. Together, they gave the world rhythm. At night, when they sat beneath the ceiling of stars that had no name yet, Hera would rest her head near Zeus's shoulder, not on it, just near, and listen to him talk about new constellations, new lands, new mortals. He spoke like a boy with too many fireworks in his pockets. And she was still learning how to hope. But love is not the same thing as rhythm. And not all storms are sudden. Some begin with laughter. Some begin with silence. The first time Hera heard whispers of Zeus's wandering, she said nothing. Not because she did not believe it, but because she did. Deep down, she had always known that he was not made to be still. He had courted her in disguises, after all. That should have been warning enough. But believing something quietly and admitting it aloud are not the same. She told herself the stories were exaggerations, that gods were prone to rumor, that nothing truly sacred could unravel so soon. She told herself to wait. She told herself to trust him, and then she saw him. Not just heard, not just suspected. She saw Zeus in the valley of Arcadia, laughing like a fool in the form of a shepherd, laying beside a woman with sunlit hair and no idea who he truly was. Hera did not descend. She did not rage. She stood still on a nearby ridge and watched the sky turn darker behind her. After that day, something shifted. She returned to Olympus and began to organize the next festival with even more detail than usual. She oversaw rituals with perfect posture, corrected misaligned offerings with a flick of her wrist, smiled when mortals praised her discipline, but no one noticed how tightly her fingers curled when she clasped them. No one asked why she stopped looking Zeus in the eyes when he made a joke at dinner. He, of course, acted as though nothing had happened. He brought her gifts, roses made of flame, golden feathers from mythical birds, scrolls of praise written by poets too afraid to speak plainly. But nothing he gave her could erase what he had taken. He did not stop. In fact, he grew bolder. He turned into bulls and swans and showers of golden rain, crossed oceans and mountain passes just to seduce another mortal who would never understand the cost of divine attention. And Hera, she began to study them. Each woman, each child, each lie, not out of jealousy, but out of accounting. She kept a private ledger, not of names, but of silence. Each name was a stone added to her patience. Each betrayal a layer of frost around her warmth. She no longer imagined a world where Zeus would change. She only wondered what form her own change would take. One evening, as Olympus buzzed with celebration, some minor god's ascension, or perhaps a victory in a war Zeus had barely participated in, Hera sat alone in the courtyard, her fingers tracing patterns on a cold marble bench. Behind her, the other gods laughed and danced, their joy too loud to notice her absence. Aphrodite passed by, trailing scent and smirk. She paused, looked at Hera, and tilted her head. "You could leave, you know," the goddess of love said softly. "No one would stop you." Hera didn't look up. "I am not here because I must stay," she replied. "I am here because I know what happens if I do not." This was not surrender. This was observation. A woman can sit still and still be dangerous. Hera began to listen to the murmurs between seasons, the discontent in the prayers offered at shrines. Mortals were confused. How could the goddess of marriage stay with a husband who defied everything she stood for? Some mocked her, some pitied her, but a few were quiet. Growing few understood because they, too, had stayed when they should have gone. They, too, had swallowed their anger because it was not yet time to speak. They began to light candles not for weddings, but for endurance, and Hera heard them. For the first time in ages, her temples began to glow not with joy, but with solidarity. She was no longer just the goddess of vows. She was becoming the goddess of silent strength. And strength, when ignored long enough, he remembers how to roar. The era of grudges. Grudges do not grow like flowers. They grow like tree roots beneath the surface, silent and stubborn. And Hera, once the goddess of mercy, began to garden differently. She still sat beside Zeus at feasts. She still poured libations with the grace of a queen. But if you looked closely, her hands no longer trembled. They calculated. The shift began not with an outburst, but with a look. It was at a celebration, one of those ever-repeating feasts that Olympus threw simply because they could. Wine poured from fountains. Laughter danced through the halls. Apollo was playing his lyre too loud, and Artemis was pretending not to roll her eyes. Zeus, as usual, was performing, telling tales of his triumphs on earth, some real, some generously reimagined. Hera listened. Silently, every now and then, she would tilt her head, as if to admire him. But what she was really doing was listening for the lies. When he spoke of Io, a mortal priestess from Argolis, Hera's expression did not change, but her breath did. He spoke of the girl like she was a passing dream, a devoted servant. He called her chaste, pure, and utterly boring. He laughed. What he did not mention was that he had taken the form of a mist to seduce her, that when Hera's presence approached, he turned the girl into a cow. A literal cow, with wide eyes and nowhere to run. Everyone at the table laughed. Everyone except Hera. She stood, slowly, unrushed, and with the calm of someone who has stopped asking for justice. She said, "A cow deserves a proper guardian." She left the feast. The next day, Argus was appointed. Argus was not a god. He was a servant of Hera. Loyal, tireless, and covered in 100 eyes, each of which only closed one at a time. He never slept fully. He watched Io endlessly, grazing alone in fields where temples once stood. It was not punishment. It was protection shaped like vengeance. Hera did not lash out. She redefined the word consequence. This was the beginning of what mortals would later call the era of grudges. Not because Hera became cruel, but because she stopped pretending that loyalty was a two-way street. She began to keep notes, not scrolls, not carved records, mental notes of who laughed when she hurt, of who looked away when Zeus wandered, of which gods offered her wine and which ones offered her silence. She forgave nothing, she punished little, but she remembered everything. Meanwhile, down in Argos, something remarkable happened. Mortals began to whisper not just to Zeus, not just to Athena or Poseidon, but to Hera, not with flattery, not for favors. They prayed in corners, behind closed doors, in kitchens and beside cradles. "Keep my house safe," they whispered. "Help my husband stay faithful. Help me survive him if he does not." And Hera heard. She began to send signs, not lightning or floods, but subtler things. A breeze when someone needed strength. A delayed caravan that kept a daughter from marrying into danger. A moment of silence when a woman finally decided to leave. In Argos, a small group of women began to meet in secret. They were not priestesses by title, but by heart. One of them, Melissa, was a widow who had burned her wedding veil in quiet rebellion. Another, Colline, had never married at all. They lit candles before sleep. They taught each other to speak their names out loud again. They stitched blue thread into their dresses as a sign of endurance. They never said Hera's name aloud, but they spoke to her anyway, and she listened. Back in Olympus, Zeus remained oblivious. He was busy turning into a white bull somewhere near Phoenicia, or perhaps disguised as a musician serenading a shepherd girl on some quiet isle. The gods gossiped. Some laughed at Hera's silence, some feared it, but none of them understood the storm she was building slowly, carefully, without flash or thunder. This was not petty jealousy. This was strategy. This was legacy. One evening, Hephaestus, the god of forge and flame, approached her chambers with a new piece of metal work, something carved delicately, shaped like a leaf, but heavy as a stone. He offered it without a word, just a nod. He had been cast from Olympus once, by Zeus. Hera had taken him back, raised him crooked but strong. He did not ask questions, and she did not explain. That was the nature of loyalty between the wounded. That night, as Hera stood beneath the stars on her balcony, wind weaving through her hair like an old song, she whispered something to the clouds. Not a curse, not a vow, just a question. How long must I carry this weight before it becomes something holy? The stars did not answer, but somewhere, far below, a woman in Argos lit a flame in Hera's name, and that was enough. For now, marriage, myth, and mayhem. By now, the myths had begun to turn against her. Not in Olympus there, most of the gods barely noticed, but in the world below, among the mortals who built temples with cracked marble and stained glass devotion, in stories told by drunk poets and half-blind historians. Hera was not a queen. She was a shrew, a nag, a divine wife clinging to a man too wild to be caught. They forgot the ritual she created, the vows she protected, the home she held together like clay in tired hands. Instead, they remembered only the punishments, the curses, the transformed girls and terrified lovers. Jealous, they said. Vengeful, they whispered. And behind every word was a shrug. What else would you expect from the goddess of marriage? Mortals had a habit of blaming the woman who stayed, especially when the man wandered. Even in shrines built for her, there was hesitation. A bride might light incense before the ceremony, then immediately whisper to Aphrodite for beauty or to Demeter for fertility. Hera became a checkbox, a formality. She watched her own rights become footnotes. And footnotes, she knew, were just one step from being erased. She would not let that happen, so she began to adapt. Not loudly, not with thunder, but with careful, intentional grace. She sent dreams to certain women, strong ones, quiet ones who lived at the edge of cities, who still believed in the sacred weight of a vow. They would wake and find new prayers on their lips, words they had never learned but somehow always known. They would light fires at night and tell their daughters that Hera was watching, not as punishment, but as witness. She began to appear not just in marble, but in motion. A woman walking alone through the marketplace, posture regal, eyes sharp. A stranger with silver threading her dark cloak, who gave counsel to a mother before disappearing into the wind. She became harder to define. Less temple, more presence. Not domesticated, but everywhere. Meanwhile, Olympus was still Olympus. Loud, proud, often oblivious. Zeus, of course, remained busy rewriting the definition of fidelity. Whenever someone brought Hera news of his latest visit to Earth, she would nod slowly, as if being told of mild weather. Yes, she'd say, he has a fondness for disguises. And then she'd return to whatever she was doing, blessing a new harvest festival, reorganizing celestial timetables, mentoring a minor goddess who still thought love could be predictable. What mortals mistook for coldness was composure, and what gods dismissed as bitterness was restraint. There was one moment, during a winter banquet, when Dionysus, already 2 goblets past sober, raised a toast. To the queen of Olympus, he slurred, who forgives what none of us would. There was laughter, some of it nervous. Hera lifted her glass, smiled politely, and said only, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is simply choosing when to remember." And the room went still. Even the fire crackled softer. It was around this time that the cult in Argos grew quietly bolder. The women who had once whispered prayers now sang them. They danced barefoot in circles. They wept together, not out of grief, but out of recognition. They began to tattoo small symbols on their wrists, knots and circles, representing unity that bends but does not break. Word reached other cities, Corinth, Mycenae, even as far as the northern cliffs where the winds howled louder than voices, and wherever a woman lit a candle in her own defense, Hera lit one too in her heart. One night, Melissa the widow, who had become an unofficial high priestess, stood before a gathering of 33 women in a sunken courtyard lit only by oil lamps and the reflection of stars. "She is not jealous," she said. "She is precise. She is not cruel, she is tired. She is not bitter, she is ancient. And she remembers everything. And 33 heads nodded. Some cried, some smiled, some whispered. So do we. Back on Olympus, none of this was spoken aloud. But Hera knew. She always knew. And knowing, as any goddess will tell you, is its own kind of power. So when the next bard came to Olympus, singing a new tale, one where Hera turned a rival into stone or cursed a child into madness, she invited him to perform. She listened to every word, clapped graciously, then asked softly, "Would you like to know the version I remember?" The bard blinked, stammered, "Yes." He said, barely audible, so she told him the true version. And when he left Olympus, he never told that story again, but he began telling others, better ones, stories with teeth and grace, with women who were not villains, but survivors. And slowly, Hera's myth began to shift, not because she demanded it, but because she waited long enough, and waited well. The Heracles incident, the child was not her enemy, not at first. When Hera first heard whispers of a mortal woman named Alcmene, already heavy with child by Zeus, she did not weep, she did not shout, she did not descend in a fury of lightning bolts. Hera simply walked to the edge of Olympus, stood above the clouds, and closed her eyes. She had heard this story before. Different name, different city, same betrayal. But there was something about this child, this one Zeus had taken special care to protect. He disguised himself as Alcmene's husband, slipped into her bed under moonlight, stretched one night into 3 with divine time. He made no effort to hide it, as if daring Hera to respond. And perhaps that was the true insult, not the affair itself, but the arrogance that came with it, the assumption that she would remain silent again. But Hera did not rush to punish the mother. That would have been too easy. Instead, she waited until the child was born. He was loud, red-cheeked, too strong for his own cradle. He broke the wooden rail with one foot when he sneezed. The midwives whispered in awe. They called him Heracles, glory of Hera, a joke, a cruel, shining joke. She did not laugh. On Olympus, Zeus paraded the boy like a prize, spoke of destiny, of greatness, of how this child would one day shake the pillars of the earth. Hera watched from her throne, hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale. The other gods kept their eyes lowered. No one dared ask her opinion, but Hera had a plan. One night, as the stars pressed quietly into the sky, Hera sent 2 serpents into the child's chamber. They were not ordinary serpents. They moved without sound, their eyes shining with a purpose not their own. The child should have died. Instead, he giggled, reached out, strangled them both with chubby fists before the nursemaid even had time to scream. The gods gasped. Zeus roared with pride. Hera said nothing, but something inside her shifted. This child was not ordinary. He would not be crushed. So she changed her strategy. If she could not destroy him, she would shape his story. She whispered into the ear of madness, planted seeds in the folds of his mind. One day, when he was older, Heracles would kill his wife and children not by choice, but by madness not his own. A moment of divine confusion. A life shattered in a blink. Then came the labors, 12 of them, each designed to humble him, to break him, to remind the world that strength was not immunity from pain. He cleaned stables that stank of centuries. He captured beasts whose breath could poison mountains. He held up the sky, just for a moment, and Hera watched. Not with glee, not with spite, but with the cold distance of someone who had once believed in vows. And no longer did mortals would call her cruel. They would say she hunted Heracles out of jealousy. They would write songs of the poor hero, tormented by the queen of gods. But what they never wrote was that Hera never once harmed him directly after the snakes. She watched his pain. Yes, she ensured the world saw his flaws, but she did not strike again, because punishment was never the point. Perspective was. Heracles would become a legend, and legends, Hera knew, needed scars. He would rise, he would stumble, he would weep, he would win, and through it all, his name would carry hers. Glory of Hera. There was something poetic about it. Bitter, but poetic. Years later, when Heracles ascended to Olympus as a god, he approached her. He knelt, not because he feared her, but because he finally understood. He had been made a weapon, and she had been the forge. She looked at him, this boy who should have been her enemy, this man who now bore the shape of Olympus itself, and she saw no defiance in him, only exhaustion. So she offered him a cup, not poisoned, not enchanted, just wine, simple. And they sat together, not as mother and son, not as queen and pawn, but as two beings shaped by betrayal, carrying the cost of Zeus's hunger in different ways. The other gods never spoke of that evening, but ever since, the stories softened, not about Heracles, about Hera, as if the world finally sensed that anger in her hand had always been a form of mourning, sisterhood of the silent flame. There were no temples carved for this, no hymns, no gold, no carved marble columns echoing her name in grand arches. But somewhere along the coastal edges of the world, in villages too small for maps and hearts too tired for stories, a new kind of devotion was growing. They called themselves the Silent Flame. They did not wear robes. They wore bread flour on their aprons and soot on their hands. They lit candles not in ceremony but in habit at dawn, at dusk, before sun. After grief, their prayers were not spoken aloud. They were whispered into boiling pots, folded into laundry, hummed beneath the breath while tending goats. Hera was not their salvation. She was their reflection. It began in Argos, as so many of her stories did. The older women, the ones whose husbands had long returned to the soil, began to gather at twilight. They shared no official doctrine. There was no leader, no chorus, no feast day, just benches, hands, and memory. They lit a small flame at the center, always just one, a clay bowl of oil, a single cotton wick. It burned steady, low and constant. They called it the flame that watches. Each woman took turns tending it. Some brought olive oil from their press. Others offered salt, grain, or wool. Once, a girl of 13 came barefoot with a bundle of wild thyme tied in blue thread. No one asked where she learned that color. They all knew. What united them was not belief. It was the bone-deep understanding of what it means to hold something together, whether a family, a house, a heart, while everything around you unravels. These women had endured silence. Some had endured betrayal. Some had endured simply being overlooked. And in Hera, they did not see wrath. They saw recognition. One evening, during the last week of autumn, the sea turned bitter early. Winds came before the harvest was gathered. Fires sputtered. And still, the flame in the bowl stayed lit. A woman named Ione, who had buried both a husband and a son, stood with her back to the wind and cupped her palms around the flickering light. Her bones ached. Her eyes were tired, but her hands did not shake. She whispered, not to be heard, but to be understood. Let no woman forget her own name. No one responded. They did not need to. The flame steadied. Word spread slowly, woman to woman, meal to meal, mile by mile, from Argos to smaller outposts, to farmsteads in the mountains, to market stalls and cities where no one dared say goddess out loud anymore. You would know a member of the Silent Flame not by what she said, but by how she lit her hearth, by how she paused a moment before closing her eyes at night, by the way she carried her sorrow not as burden, but as badge. They shared a symbol, not a sigil or brand, just a single loop of blue thread, often sewn into the hem of a sleeve or the lining of a dress. Some wore it in plain sight. Others hid it beneath the collar, like a promise kept only to themselves. Hera did not demand their loyalty. She had given up on being worshipped for perfection long ago. But this was different. She began to visit them, not in form, but in feeling. A sudden hush in the kitchen when grief rose without warning. The stillness before a child's cry. The calm after a slammed door. Wherever there was pain swallowed instead of screamed, she was there. She did not fix it. She never promised healing. She promised presence. And sometimes that was enough. Back in Olympus, no one spoke of these women. They were not priestesses. They did not offer Zeus praise. They were beneath notice, but Hera noticed. She always had. One night, when the wind curled through her chambers with a colder bite than usual, Hera stood before her mirror, not the polished silver used by vanity, but a basin of still water used for reflection. She saw herself, not the queen, not the wife, not the myth, just the woman who had carried silence long enough to birth a revolution out of it. She dipped her finger into the water, let the ripple spread, and somewhere far below, a woman in Delphi paused mid-lullaby. Eyes wide, she felt seen. She did not know why, but she lit a candle anyway. Blue thread wrapped once, gently. Around the base, the flame caught, steady, watching. And so, the sisterhood grew without rules, without fanfare, but with fire. There is always one moment that changes the silence. Not the first betrayal, not the second, not even the third, but the moment when the wound stops aching and starts burning. The moment you no longer ask, "Why me?" You ask, "Why not burn the whole thing down?" For Hera, that moment came during a feast. Of course it did. It was the spring banquet of the Moirai, the Fates, 3 ancient sisters older than most gods dared to remember. Even Zeus treated them with a kind of reverence he reserved for storms he could not control. The celebration was held high above the mortal world, in open air, under a sky folding from lavender to indigo. A long table shimmered with gold and grapes. Garlands of olive branches draped over platters too rich to taste. The gods lounged like lions. The wine was endless, and laughter moved like wind through the marble columns. It should have been beautiful. It should have been sacred. And then someone, Apollo or Hermes, it hardly matters now, decided it would be fun to act out Zeus's greatest hits. His conquests, his disguises, his divine comedy of seduction. "Shall we tell a story?" they said. The gods cheered. Even Athena, ever serious, allowed herself a smile. Hermes transformed into a swan, flapping across the feast like a jester. Poseidon helped mimic the bull that carried Europa. Even Dionysus played along, hiccuping through lines of misremembered romance. They all laughed. At the girl who believed the stranger in her bed was her husband, at the maidens caught between prayer and power, at the man who wore masks and called it love. And Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, guardian of vows, sat 3 seats away. Wine untouched, spine straight, smile practiced. No one noticed that she hadn't blinked in nearly a minute. And Zeus, he leaned back, laughed loudest, then turned to her and said, "They're only stories, dear, dear." That word cracked something she hadn't even realized was still holding. Hera stood. She did not curse. She did not flip the table. She simply set her goblet down and left. Her footsteps did not echo, but her silence did. She returned to her chambers and removed her crown. Not in anger, not in drama, just carefully, as one might set down a burden after too long. She sat by her window, where the stars still pulsed in soft rhythm. She had once found comfort in them. Now they seemed distant, watching, indifferent, and she whispered, not in wrath, not in weakness, but in clarity. "They think silence means peace." She said it again, slower. "They think my stillness means surrender." And then she smiled, not cruelly, not sweetly, but like someone remembering their full name after years of being called something smaller. She had kept Olympus whole. She had carried the weight. She had played the part. But if a throne could not protect her from mockery, what good was it? She would no longer play at peace while her pain was their entertainment. The next morning, the skies above Olympus shifted, not with lightning, not with storm, but with stillness so exact, it felt sharp. Mortals noticed. Birds flew lower. Wind avoided temples. And yet, no thunder came. Hera did not appear at council, did not send her handmaidens, did not bless the sunrise. Instead, she lit a small blue flame in her private chamber. It was quiet, steady, the same blue that now ran through the hems of dresses in Argos, in Mycenae, in kitchens and altars and hearts. The blue of thread, the blue of belief, the blue of fire that does not scream but refuses to die. She whispered 3 words into that flame, not in Greek, not in divine tongue, but in the quiet language of women who have endured too much for too long. The language that needs no translation. And far below, the world listened. It began with names, not gods, not kings, but women. Hera started to speak them aloud when she was alone. Names of girls forgotten in the footnotes of Zeus's escapades. Callisto, Semele, Leto, Alcmene, Europa, Io. Names that history had tried to flatten into side characters. Lovers, victims, warnings, But to Hera, they were the names of women who had looked into the eyes of power and come away broken or pregnant, or both. She wrote their names onto small slips of parchment, not to keep as trophies, but as inventory. She placed them in a lacquered box, not locked, but sealed with a quiet ribbon. Blue? Of course, the color of her era, the color of survival. That box sat beside her bed, and each night before resting, she touched the lid, not with bitterness, but with reverence. These women were not her enemy. They were her evidence. The plan didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, like frost forming along a window pane. A degree at a time, a breath held longer, a silence sustained until it became structure. Hera did not want war. War was Zeus's language fire and force and forgetting. Hera wanted something that could not be undone. Not with a sword, not with a thunderbolt. Something that would reshape Olympus the way a steady river reshapes a mountain, not by breaking it, but by refusing to move around it anymore. She began to gather, not weapons, but allies, unlikely ones. Hephaestus was the first. He did not ask questions. He had grown up watching the way she navigated a kingdom that never quite wanted her, yet still relied on her to stay standing. He knew what it meant to be thrown away, then needed again. He built for her not weapons, but symbols. A small crest carved into the bottom of certain plates, certain amphoras, certain sandals, a flame wrapped in thread. It was invisible to the unknowing, but unmistakable to those who had been waiting. Then came Hestia, quiet, steady, underestimated Hestia, goddess of the hearth, keeper of domestic peace. While the others debated war and conquest, Hestia tended flame. She did not shout, she did not scheme, but she was never absent. Hera invited her to tea one afternoon. No grand strategy, just warmth. No orders, just memory. And in that warmth, something ancient rekindled. The idea that power can be quiet and still be power. Then Iris the messenger, the rainbow path between gods and mortals. She became the thread through which Hera's intent traveled discreetly, faithfully. Not every whisper needed thunder. Sometimes it only needed color. And finally, the mortals. Not all of them. Not the kings or priests or bards who bent stories toward convenience. But the women, the firekeepers, the blue-threaded. Hera began appearing in their dreams again. Not as a queen, but as a voice that asked only one question. Are you ready to be seen differently? The answer came not in words, but in action. Candles stayed lit longer. Shrines were cleaned with quiet devotion. Girls began telling each other different versions of the old myths, the ones where Hera was not vengeful, but vigilant. Not jealous, but just this was not rebellion. This was reclamation. Olympus, of course, did not notice at first. That was the point. Zeus was busy with new temples. Dionysus was drunk on some island. Athena was debating with mortals again. And Apollo, he had taken up songwriting. No one saw the shift because it didn't roar. It rustled, and rustling, Hera knew, becomes thunder if ignored long enough. One morning, the hours arrived at her chambers early. They said nothing, but in their hands were folded pieces of fabric, plain white cloth, each stitched with blue. They laid them at her feet, then bowed. Hera did not cry, but her breath caught just once. In that moment, she understood something ancient and unshakable. Vengeance was not about fury, it was about memory. It was about refusing to let someone else define your silence as consent. She walked out to the courtyard of Olympus, still half shrouded in morning mist. No one expected her there. She stood in the center, beneath the tall columns, surrounded by echoes and eyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand apology. She simply said, there will be a reckoning, but not of thunder, of remembrance. And then she turned and left. The mist followed, and Olympus, for the first time in an age, remembered how to hold its breath. For a long time, Zeus did not notice, or maybe he noticed but chose to ignore it. That was his way. If it did not roar or crack open the sky, it was not real to him. He was the god of spectacle, of declarations, of sudden light. He had no understanding of things that grew slowly, quietly, beneath his feet. But one day long after the spring banquet, long after Hera began to weave her new network of flame and thread, he began to sense it. At first, it was small. His prayers came more thinly than before. Not gone, but delayed. not from fear, but forgetfulness. A name once shouted with reverence, now mumbled as a formality. Temples that once bore his statue at the center now had it slightly off to the side, as if the sculptor had hesitated. Zeus felt the shift. Like a breeze you think is nothing until you realize your foundation is swaying. He summoned Hera, as he always had, with thunder 3 precise strikes in the courtyard outside her chambers. But she did not appear. Not immediately. She sent Iris instead, and Iris came with neither apology nor excuse, just a calm message. The queen is attending to matters of balance. Zeus laughed, not kindly. Balance, he said. The balance is mine to keep. Iris did not respond. She only bowed and left. That silence, Hera's silence, now delivered by proxy, cut deeper than thunder. And Zeus, for the first time in a very long time, felt cold. He went to find her himself, traveled through the palace, down corridors he hadn't walked in centuries, past quiet rooms, still gardens, and halls where the torches burned blue instead of gold. The firelight was softer now, cooler, not less powerful, but changed. It did not dance. It watched. He found her not on her throne, not at a feast, but standing in the observatory, gazing down at the mortal world. She was tracing the curve of a river with her finger, not moving it, not reshaping it, just understanding its path. He stepped into the room, expecting her to turn, to acknowledge him, to smile. She did not. He said her name. She said, "There are villages that no longer speak of you." His breath hitched, not because of the words, but because of the tone. It was not accusatory. It was factual, like reading the weather. He said, "They are mortal. Mortals forget." She said, "No." They remember differently now. Zeus frowned. Power, to him, was something you showed. You raised your voice. You grew taller. You shook the ground. But Hera had become something else. Something still, and therefore immovable. He reached for her hand. She stepped back. Not far, just enough. He said, "You are my wife." She said, "I am the goddess of marriage." And that was the difference. He had always seen her as extension, as presence beside him, as loyalty dressed in silk. But she had remembered something he never could. She was not chosen. She chose, and she could choose again. He left that chamber not in fury, but in confusion. And that, for Zeus, was far worse. In the days that followed, he tried to reclaim the narrative. He visited temples. He called down storms that made no one flinch. He gifted mortals with favors, gold, rain, but it felt like bribery. The gratitude was hollow. The prayers still came, but now, more often, they were whispered to both of them, or to her alone. Even some gods shifted. Artemis stopped mocking the blue flames. Athena spoke Hera's name more thoughtfully. Hestia began placing a second cup on the hearth, one for the house, one for the memory of balance. Zeus did not rage. He recalculated. That was his survival skill. Not strength, not charm, but adaptation. So he watched. He watched as women lit candles, not for fertility, but for fairness. He watched as mothers taught their daughters the story of Hera, not the scorned wife, but the silent architect of continuity. He watched Olympus begin to breathe differently, and though he never said it aloud, he began to fear that he was no longer the center of it. Because Hera, once called the goddess of keeping things whole, was now the goddess of knowing when to let something break. It started in kitchens, not councils, not battles, not high halls of power, but kitchens, places where stories were told over boiling pots and hands were busy, where silence was a form of prayer. The uprising, if it could even be called that, did not arrive with banners or drums. It arrived with bread, with salt, with rituals so old that no one remembered why they began, only that they felt right. Women started doing things differently. They lit their hearths twice a day instead of once morning for survival, evening for memory. They added one extra strand of thread to their weaving blue. Subtle, firm, they whispered to each other across market stalls and laundry lines, not in slogans, but in reminders. You are not small. You are not wrong. You are not alone. No one declared rebellion, but Hera knew it for what it was. Power was shifting not upward, but outward. Not taken, but returned. It moved like water, gentle, steady, capable of wearing down stone. By the time the high priest in Athens noticed the change, it was already too late to reverse it. Attendance at Zeus's temples remained steady out of habit, mostly, but at Hera's quiet shrines, many no larger than a closet or a shelf devotion surged. People came not to beg, but to breathe. They lit oil, they laid down truths, they left blue flowers, folded prayers, and promises they intended to keep. The gods, of course, debated. Apollo said it was a phase. Athena said it was reason taking form. Poseidon rolled his eyes and made a storm. But none of it worked. None of it shifted the tide, because it was not a movement. It was a return. And Hera, she did not sit higher. She sat deeper, not on a throne, but in a space between need and knowing. She received no armies, but she had attention. She gave no decrees, but she had direction. And most importantly, she stopped apologizing for being the god of keeping things together when no one else cared they were falling apart. In Corinth, an old widow named Thelsa began writing stories. Not myths, stories. Her own and others' little things. What it was like to lose a child and still rise. What it meant to cook alone, to sleep alone, to choose peace instead of permission. She did not publish. She read them aloud at a fountain each Sunday. At first, it was just her. Then 3 came, then 8, then 30. By summer, people stood in the heat just to hear someone say words that did not demand, but affirmed. She always lit a small blue candle before speaking. When someone asked who it honored, she said, the part of me that I had to hide for too long. In Delphi, a group of girls started wearing rings carved from bone and dyed with iris petals. They made a promise to each other to speak plainly, to refuse roles that did not fit, to marry only when they wanted, and only who they chose. They called it the vow without chains. And on Olympus, Hera heard. She didn't intervene. She simply held it all, like she always had. But now, the holding was hers by choice. Not duty, not pressure, not pity, hers. Some gods whispered that she was growing too powerful, but power had never been the point. Presence was. Zeus finally stopped asking her to attend feasts, not out of cruelty, but because he sensed deeply, and perhaps with sorrow, that the place beside him was no longer the only throne that mattered. Because Hera had built something far older than Olympus. She had built faith without fear. She had made rage into architecture. She had taken every silence handed to her and turned it into space for others to stand taller, softer, and more themselves. No armies needed. No fire reigned. Just breath, steady, soft, unstoppable. There comes a moment when even the most sacred roles must be unstitched. Not destroyed, not disgraced. Just let go. Hera stood before the mirror, not the silver one gifted by Hephaestus, not the polished surface in her court chamber, but the quiet basin of water in her private garden, where no gods visited and no titles echoed. She looked at her own reflection and asked, not aloud, but within herself, is this still me? The woman in the water was not the same bride who once stepped into Olympus in gold. She was not the same mother who held the weight of eternity in her arms. She was not the same queen who sat beside thunder. She was something else now, older, yes, but deeper, threaded through with memory, and free. The role of queen had once felt like honor. Now, it felt like armor she no longer needed. She had held Olympus together with rituals and patience and rules no one else remembered. She had kissed brows in blessing, stitched seasons into place, ensured the sacred flame never dimmed. And in return, they gave her formality, fear, and blame. But now, no one asked for her permission. They asked for her presence. No one sought her judgment. They sought her truth. She took the ceremonial robe from its hook, deep crimson, hemmed in gold, and folded it slowly, not in resentment, but in relief. The robe did not cry. It did not beg. It simply softened under her fingers, as if it too had been waiting for this ending. Later that morning, she walked the halls of Olympus in her simplest gown linen, loose, cloud-colored, no crown, no attendants. Her footsteps made no sound, but they carried weight. When she entered the throne chamber, the gods turned. Conversations paused. Eyes widened. Zeus sat already on his high seat, tall, golden, etched in storm. When he saw her, something in his gaze flickered. Not anger, not fear, recognition. She did not ask permission to speak. She had not asked permission in a long time. "I will no longer be queen," she said. No flourish, no thunder, just truth. Gasps rose, quickly stifled. Even Ares, bold and brash, said nothing. The words echoed in the chamber like slow bells quiet. Then rippling outward, "I will still be here," she continued. But not as title, as being. Zeus opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to reason, but Hera raised a hand, gently, palm open. "I am not stepping down. I am stepping out." He closed his mouth, because even he understood that when a woman removes her crown, not in defeat, but in decision, no one can stop her. She left the chamber the way she came, in silence. But the silence was not absence, it was presence, complete, unshaken. Word spread across the mortal world faster than storm. In Argos, women stood taller. In Sparta, girls stitched new patterns. In Thebes, a priestess tore out pages of an old scroll and wrote her own prayers. They did not mourn the queen. They celebrated the choice. For too long, Hera had been told that duty was her virtue, that loyalty meant silence, that staying meant strength. But now, she offered a different lesson. Sometimes, the strongest vow is the one you release with grace. And so, the role unmade itself, not in fire, not in shame, but in stillness. In its place, Hera became something more, not above Olympus, not against it, but beside it, the way rivers run beside mountains, shaping them without asking permission. The throne room missed her, though it would never admit it. The marble felt colder, the air less sure of itself. Meetings were held, decisions made, seasons turned, but something vital had gone quiet. Hera no longer sat in judgment, and yet, judgment still came more balanced now, more patient, not from above, but from within. The gods continued their rituals, but fewer looked each other in the eye when they spoke her name. She had not vanished. She simply stopped performing. No more grand entrances, no more robes that spoke louder than her words. She walked the gardens in bare feet now, letting the earth remind her that divinity could be soft. Too, mortals called it retirement, but they misunderstood. She had not withdrawn, she had dispersed. Her presence was no longer seated in one place. It moved through kitchens, fire pits, stories told at dusk. Her power no longer needed echoing halls to sound true. It lived in subtler places. A mother holding her ground, a widow saying no without explanation, a girl daring to ask, "Why not me?" Even the wind seemed to move differently around her now, no longer bending in deference. It danced with her, not around. With, she began to travel not to oversee, but to witness. She walked the stone paths of small towns and let children offer her figs without knowing her name. She sat beside well springs and listened to songs written in languages older than Olympus. And everywhere she went, there was always one thing, a candle, small and steady, burning blue, in windows, on porches, beneath kitchen shelves, unclaimed but unmistakable. The sisterhood of the silent flame no longer needed to gather in secret. They didn't need to gather at all. The flame had moved into them. They were not Hera's army. They were her echo. And echoes, when multiplied across distance and time, become movement. Back in Olympus, Zeus found himself restless. The palace was still his. The sky still bent at his command. But without Hera beside him, it all felt loud and somehow lonely. He tried to summon her once more, sent gifts, messages, even a bird carved from storm cloud and gold. But none of them returned, not with anger, just not at all. He began to see her everywhere, not in illusion, but in consequence, in the way Artemis no longer bowed so deeply, in how Athena, sharp-tongued and rational, now paused to listen more, in the way Aphrodite spent more time with mortals, speaking softly to women in mirrors, saying, "Yes, you're allowed to want more." He began to wonder, had he lost her, or had he simply never held her to begin with? And Hera, she felt no bitterness, only clarity. She had been the queen, yes, but that title had always been an agreement. And once the agreement broke, so did the need for the crown. She had not lost power. She had redistributed it. She had become something harder to dethrone, essential. At twilight, she often sat outside, not on a throne, but on a worn stone bench beneath cypress trees, she would sip warm honey water and watch the stars appear one by one. Some nights, a woman would join her, a stranger, a mother, a question in human shape. Hera never offered miracles, only presence, and sometimes that was all they needed. She told stories not of Olympus, but of real things, of growing things, of letting go. She spoke less like a god and more like a grandmother with too many memories and a perfectly sharpened sense of what mattered. And when asked what she called herself now, she would smile, not evasive, just honest. I am the fire, no longer the crown. Peace came, not all at once, but in familiar ways. In the sound of dry leaves being swept from a stone floor, in the slow boil of evening tea, in the small space between inhale and exhale where no one needed her to be anything but present. Hera did not call it peace, not at first. It felt more like stillness, a quiet that no longer demanded performance, a room that no longer waited for her decision. And slowly, she realized this was peace. Not absence of war, but absence of weight. She no longer dreamt of thrones. She dreamt of streams, of thread being pulled clean through fabric, of women laughing with their eyes closed. The kind of laughter that only arrives after sorrow has left its mark and been allowed to stay a while. She walked more now, sometimes barefoot through her garden, sometimes through villages where her name was no longer invoked with fear, but with warmth. People would nod, not in worship, but in recognition. They did not ask her to fix things. They simply let her be part of the air around them. In one town, a baker named Hera offered her a seat and a crust of honeyed bread. Hera took it, no ceremony, no divine glow, just woman to woman. They sat together as the oven cooled, and Hera spoke of her sister, long lost to the seas. Hera listened when Hera cried. She did not comfort her with prophecy. She handed her a cloth and said, "You're allowed to mourn without a timeline." In another place, a girl named Nephilim asked if it was true had Hera really sent snakes to a child. Hera did not deny it. She did not rewrite the story. She said, "I was not always who I am now." The girl nodded, as if that was the most honest thing a god had ever said. That was the peace Hera had been building, without knowing it. The freedom to be whole, not perfect, not feared, just whole, full of mistakes, full of growth, full of fire that had learned to warm instead of scorch. She no longer kept a court, but she kept letters. Dozens arrived each week, written in ink, in charcoal, in blood from pricked fingers. Stories, confessions, blessings, not addressed to Her Majesty, just to Hera. Some came from women who had left behind cruel husbands. Some from girls who said no for the first time and lived to tell it. Some from men who learned how to listen. She read them all, carefully, often twice, sometimes aloud. And then she would light a small flame, always blue, and whisper back into the smoke, "You are not alone." That was the new vow. Not the kind exchanged at altars or sealed in gold, but the kind passed between women who had held their tongues too long and finally let them go. On Olympus, some still asked when she would return, as if she had gone anywhere, as if presence required position. But Hera knew better. She had become the quiet breath before truth, the soft glance exchanged in understanding, the steady hum of dignity that did not need an audience. In temples old and new, no statues were raised. No feasts were thrown, but candles stayed lit longer. Eyes closed with less fear. The air inside these places felt like her not because she had claimed them, but because she no longer needed to. At night, she sometimes sat beneath the stars with no agenda, no planning, no prophecy, just air, just breath, just Hera. And that, she thought, was the greatest rebellion of all, to be exactly as she was, without apology. Even after she stepped away, Hera's presence deepened, not like a storm approaching, but like roots growing beneath the earth. She no longer stood on marble, but she stood in moments, in choices, in the quiet strength of those who kept showing up, even when the world did not say thank you. In cities across the sea, young women began placing blue stones above their door frames. They didn't always know why, only that it felt safe. It felt right. Sailors wore them, two-stitched into their sleeves, hidden beneath tattoos. When asked, they would shrug and say, "For the goddess who sees." No temples were built anew, but wells were kept cleaner. Thresholds were swept with care. Children were taught not just to pray, but to pause, to notice the invisible things. A pot simmering without boiling over, a mother's hand brushing a tear without a word, a woman sitting alone, not waiting, just being. Hera had once ruled through structure marriage, vows, law. Now she ruled through memory, through the way people chose to remember her, not as jealous, not as cruel, but as someone who had endured and, more impressively, had transformed. In a mountain village, a girl named Pauline carved her own path to the sea. She had been promised to a man who never asked her what she wanted. One night, with only a satchel and a silver pendant, she walked away, not in rage, in clarity. As she moved through the forest, she whispered Hera's name, not for protection, for a witness. And when she reached the shore, a woman in blue offered her bread, said nothing else, just handed her a slice, warm and sweet, and kept walking. Hera was there, though no lightning fell. In the north, a healer named Marin placed a mirror above her hearth. Each morning she would look into it, light a blue candle, and say aloud, "I am still here." Her neighbors thought it odd at first, but soon others followed. Soon, every home on her street had a mirror, a candle, and a whispered truth, not for worship, for grounding, for choosing again each day not to disappear. Olympus remained, tall, gleaming, full of ceremony, but its weight had changed. Without Hera to hold the seams in place, the gods began to shift. Some softened, some grew restless, some asked themselves what they were really for. Ares, for the first time, turned down a war. Aphrodite began visiting women's circles in disguise, listening instead of speaking. Athena wrote a letter to a mortal philosopher and ended it with, "Tell me what you think, honestly." Change had never moved this way before, not from Olympus downward, but from the earth up. Hera, meanwhile, continued to walk quietly, sometimes barefoot, sometimes cloaked. Sometimes she helped midwives in silence. Sometimes she just stood under the moon and breathed. Her power no longer required temples or praise. It lived in every decision made in truth. She became a myth again, but this time, not of fear, of resilience. Grandmothers told her story like a bedtime hush. There once was a queen who gave up her crown and found something greater. Girls painted blue lines on their arms and said, "This is my flame," not to fight, but to remind themselves that they could burn without breaking. Even Zeus, high above, began to dream differently. His sleep was restless now, not haunted, just quiet in an unfamiliar way. He once ruled the sky with certainty, but now the sky no longer roared on command. It listened. And in that listening, something began to settle. Hera had never wanted to be feared. She wanted to be known. And now, finally, she was, not as an accessory to thunder, not as a warning sign for wrath, but as a woman who stayed long enough to understand and left when it was time. Maybe there's a quiet lesson in all of this, not one carved in stone or declared in oracle smoke, just something simple, something that comes in the hush between moments. Hera never wrote a doctrine. She never proclaimed her freedom to the stars, but her story rewrote itself one choice at a time, one silence at a time, until what was once a title became a presence, and what was once a woman wrapped in responsibility became a woman wrapped in clarity. It was never about revenge, not really. It was about remembering that loyalty means nothing if it costs you yourself. That marriage, at its heart, is not chains or ceremony, but the choice to be seen. And when that choice is not returned, sometimes the holiest thing you can do is walk away. Hera didn't burn Olympus. She simply stopped fueling its fire. She stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to thunder, stopped holding things together that weren't willing to stand on their own. She let things fall. And in the falling, she gave permission to others to do the same. Not all queens need thrones. Not all legacies need blood. Sometimes, the most radical act is to live fully, honestly, without needing applause. That was Hera's quiet revolution. She lived her truth in a world that had always preferred her contained. She chose warmth over control, peace over pageantry, and meaning over tradition. For centuries, she was asked to represent the perfect wife, but now she represents something more enduring, the sacred art of not disappearing inside someone else's story. She became the goddess of boundaries, of returning home to oneself. of understanding that devotion should never require silence. People still speak her name, not always loudly, but sincerely, in kitchens, in bedrooms, in the mirror before sleep. They speak her name when they draw a line, when they leave the table, when they stay but on their own terms. She does not demand offerings, but she notices intention. She answers not with miracles, but with steadiness. Maybe that's the lesson, that gods are not meant to be feared, but understood, and that healing comes, not in thunderclaps, but in the courage to say, this is no longer mine to carry. In that way, Hera lives in all of us, in the woman who pauses before forgiving again, in the girl who says, I need more, in the grandmother who sits on her porch, candle lit, watching the sun fall without needing to explain her peace, not because she is bitter, because she has become whole. So maybe the story of Hera was never meant to be a tragedy. Maybe it was a mirror, one that shows us the quiet strength of choosing self-respect over applause. That teaches us love does not have to mean sacrifice without return. That loyalty, when unreciprocated, can turn into a weight no heart should carry forever. Hera's journey reminds us that power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it's the soft decision made at midnight, the whisper that says, I deserve more. The moment you sit with your pain not to be consumed by it, but to understand its shape, then let it rest. From her, we learn that letting go is not the same as giving up, that stepping back can be an act of holy defiance, that no crown is worth more than your peace. And perhaps most of all, Hera shows us that there is no shame in staying too long, only wisdom in knowing when it is finally time to leave. If tonight you are listening from your porch, or tucked under a blanket with the windows cracked just enough to feel the breeze, then know this, your quiet matters, your breath matters, and somewhere, a blue flame is still burning, not to call for war, but to remind you that your story isn't over, not even close. So if this story brought you peace or helped you breathe a little slower, I want to thank you deeply, sincerely. If you're still awake, I invite you to share a thought in the comments, maybe about a moment you claimed your voice, or a memory where you chose softness over shouting. Leave a candle emoji if you're holding space for someone tonight. And if you believe in keeping these quiet, powerful stories alive, consider liking, sharing, or following this channel, because the more we tell them, the more they become part of us. Until next time, let your heart rest easy. The fire is still burning. Good night.